Welcome everybody to the fourth session of the From the Ground Up Western Cover Crop Council Pacific Northwest Subregional Conference Series. My name is Stephen Hines. I'm an extension educator with the University of Idaho, and I'll be your host today. I would like to mention that this conference is sponsored by a grant of the Western SARE organization. So today's session is going to focus on the seed industry side of the cover crops. Okay, I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Terron Pickett is with the NRCS in Utah, and he's going to be talking about some cover crop trialing that was done in the more dry part of the country here in Aberdeen, Idaho. Welcome, Terron.
Thanks, Steve. My name's Terron Pickett, and I currently work down in Utah as a resource soil scientist for the southern part of the state. And I had the opportunity to conduct the Aberdeen, Idaho cover crop variety trial. These were our growing considerations, 2 different years that we did the trial from 2016 to 2017. Of course, we inoculated our seed right before planting. Our planting was on the 25th of August that year. We did broadcast a granular fertilizer pre-plant that year, according to soil test recommendations. And then just that fall, we applied 10 inches of irrigation water at 2-inch intervals, 5 different times. Our high temperature was 91, and the low that year, that winter, was minus 23 degrees. And then we did experience a little bit of ponding that following spring when the snow melted on our plots. Our growing degree days in 2016 was 687, and that was from planting till December 1st. And then we had a high weed pressure that year. Next, please. Pretty much, we treated the seed the same the next year, but we planted a week earlier, and again applied fertilizer to our soil test recommendations. Only this time it was post-plant. We put on only 8 inches this year. Experienced a little bit higher temps, especially through the winter, with just -5 that year and 741 growing degree days from planting to the 1st of December. So we already kind of went through these. As Annie mentioned, we had one subspecies, woolly pod vetch, it's not as winter hardy. So I'm just going to go through general observations. Our average seeds for the trial was 17,146 on our hairy vetch varieties, and TNT had the largest seed, with Groff having the smallest seed. Lana woolly pod vetch was the most impressive going into winter. It shot out of the ground and produced what appeared to be the most biomass. And then as far as the true hairy vetch varieties, TNT looked to have the most for those varieties going into winter, next to Lana. Even though, well, there were very noticeable difference there, but even though there were noticeable differences statistically, our varieties were very close. And so some of the less impressive varieties visually were statistically superior in our evaluated categories. As you can see in the photo in the background, that there's quite a bit of variance in those plots, in those hairy vetch plots. And those differences were seen in all 4 reps and in both years, sorry. So like I said, in the coldest winter, we had a complete kill on Lana. It didn't survive that first winter where it got down so cold. But the second winter, it did survive down to -5 at 60% of the plants survived. And then just a note on seed, it was pretty impressive statistically. So I did reach out to try to find some seed from my own place, and I couldn't find it anywhere. It wasn't available. Might not be everybody's experience, but that was mine. And then a final observation on the hairy vetch is Lana, not to be confused with Lana, was the most blue-gray. It's just a general observation, and it seemed to be more pubescent than the other varieties. So that there was very noticeable differences in the crimson clover varieties. Specifically, 2 of the varieties didn't seem to be as adapted to Aberdeen, and those were AU, Sunup, and Cuntia. The other 4 varieties did show, they looked very similar except for just in their germination and early on, but Kentucky Pride was the exception, which it flowered later than the other 4 varieties that did pretty well. And it also measured taller, but keep in mind that we measured that at 50% bloom. So we had a couple, or, you know, as long as to where it flowered to have that extra height. And I'd imagine that even, we didn't test it, but would have equated into biomass production as well. So the photo that you see there in the background are 3 different varieties that we did. And left to right there is Kentucky Pride, and then AU Sunup, which didn't do as well, and then AU Sunrise. I did notice that our crimson clover was very attractive to pollinators among our plots, and hairy vetch was the next one that was visited by a lot of pollinator species, and it seemed like bumblebees were the most prevalent pollinators, though the largest, maybe the most noticeable too. And then one other note, kind of, Annie also talked a little bit about this, but where there was pooling on the ground after that first winter where we had so much snow and it was so cold, it did kill out some of our crimson clover portions of the plots, and it didn't seem to be, that pooling didn't seem to affect the other species as much in the trial. So my red clover observations is that these seem to be the least variable just to the eye, but there are still noticeable differences. Like Annie said, where it's kind of a short-lived perennial, it didn't seem to produce the biomass as some of the other ones, that some of the other clovers did. This photo in the background, you can see this is coming out of winter, the winter of 2017-18. And then look at the rye just to the right there. You can see at the top right, just the contrast in biomass production there. And that's just characteristic of the clovers compared to the grasses. So where we could really see the differences in red clover was in the data. The best performers were Cyclone 2 and Dynamite. They were almost identical in their statistics in our in Aberdeen trial. One kind of interesting thing is Cyclone 2 had a few white flowered red clover plants, and it was kind of neat. And then Mammoth, it sticks out not because of it was exceptional or poor performance, but in our trial, by the time we terminated in mid-June, it still hadn't flowered. So we didn't get that data on it. This Mammoth's kind of more of a, it's not as pinpointed. It seems to be more of a generic variety. And so I can't say that every lot of Mammoth is performed that way. It just might've been the one that we got. And then we also had quite a few bees visiting our red clover plots as well. And if you're looking for persistence in your cover crop for nitrogen production, you wouldn't have to plant the next year as well. The red clover would do that. It did overwinter and finally put on quite a bit of biomass for us in the spring. Our average seeds on the peas was 3,439, with spring peas at 3,100 and winter peas at 3,600, because there was three spring pea varieties in the trial. Maxim was the largest, with Whistler being the smallest seed, and Survivor kind of close in there as far as smaller seed goes. The spring varieties in Aberdeen grew up really quick, just kind of jumped out of the ground. They didn't have as many tendrils as the winter varieties, and they seemed to produce enough biomass to kind of control the weeds in the fall and a little bit in the spring, but that was short-lived, where it was such a fragile biomass the next spring on the ground, it kind of just disintegrated. And then Survivor 15 had the most biomass production in the fall. It kind of could compete with them spring varieties. This photo in the background shows you the differences in the pea plots. So in our 2016-17 trial, Survivor 15 was the only one that made it through the winter that year. And we had quite a bit of weed pressure that year as well, but we only collected data on Survivor 15, and it did really well, where everything else just seemed to winter kill or either got diseases, because that winter we also seen quite a bit of disease on even the weeds. The shepherd's purse, there's a typo there, but about 3 to 5 inches of the top of the shepherd's purse had some kind of a scale on it, some kind of a disease there. And we even seen snow mold on the lawn, what we thought was snow mold on the lawn at the Plant Materials Center there in Aberdeen that year. So I seen, you know, basically the same thing that Annie did here with the different blots of clovers, frontier and fixation, and you can see them side by side there. In this slide, they're just swapped. So fixation's on the left, frontier on the right. And some of the observations on that was the biggest thing that we noticed with our winters got down into the negative numbers is that both survived, which is not what the literature really says on them. Lots of clovers. Fixation did produce much more biomass than frontier, but frontier did bloom 1 month earlier in our trial, and fixation did have better survival for winter. And if you're looking for biomass, I'd go for fixation. But again, if you're just looking for like a living mulch in your garden, something without a lot of competitiveness and it grows pretty low, you might choose frontier on that. So our radish varieties, and we found this out during the trial kind of, but we thought it was just daikon radish, but there were 3 oilseed radish varieties in there. I won't go through them, but you can see the 3 there on the slide. Observations on radish, 34,000 seeds was our average in the varieties that we tried. Every one of them winter killed the first winter where it got so cold in our trial. But the second winter where it was more mild, we did have all 3 of the oilseed radish varieties in some plots survive. And then also Graza survived the winter that year. And Defender and Graza survived. There were plants in all 4 of our plots that year that survived for those. The radish plots, it was interesting for Defender. Some of our plots the second year looked really good and some weren't as good. And Defender was the most noticeable. And that was kind of consistent. With the 4 plots, some of them looked really good with the same variety and some had 2 of the plots that maybe didn't look so good. So I don't know what happened there. Graza performed the poorest in both years. One note on that is the seed of Graza that I just observed, the seed was lighter and we used the same lot both years. So maybe that seed was just immature or something and we just didn't have as good a seed on that variety. I don't know for sure on that. We did do some biomass sampling the first year on radish. Sodbuster had the highest yield where Graza had the lowest, and just, you know, take it for what it's worth. That was just 1 year of data. An interesting thing with the radish is that even though we did harvest that late fall into November, we still saw weed control of annual weeds the following spring, just in those little 24 by 24 inch areas that we harvested. So just a note there, it's potential, you have potential with radish to be able to graze it maybe and still see some weed control the following year. And then it also did survive, the radish did survive down into the single digits. All of them did before frost killed. With the rye, I'm just going to come out with a few interesting things where I'm running short on time. We had 2 of the varieties completely winter killed both years in Aberdeen. So interesting enough, if people are worried about, you know, it overwintering, as long as you plant it late enough, then planting dates that we had, FL 401 and Merced, both from extreme different parts of the country, but both in warm climates, didn't do well in Aberdeen. They went to boot before that fall, and neither one of them made it through winter. Renza Bruzzi was a little spotty. Portions of the plot survived, so that one might be a little scary if you're, you know, anyways, it's kind of unpredictable is what I'm going to say. And then all the rest of them did survive. The tallest rye varieties in our trial was Wheeler, and like Annie, Bracetto was the shortest but most uniform. We had one in there called Guardian, and it just tillered like crazy. It did a really good job at tillering. It didn't survive the winter well, but you couldn't tell it in the plots because it just had so many tillers following spring. Let's see what else here. Rye will do really well at controlling weeds as long as you start with a weed-free seed bed. And it by far produced the most biomass, stayed green all winter. The oats, we had a true, like Annie said, a true black oat variety, and then one that wasn't. We saw basically the same thing that she did. Cossack had like a black tinted seed, and it's a lot more dense, more characteristic seed there. Soil Saver got taller before winter, and it went to flower but it winter killed both years, and then both years are Cossack. Some plants, not a lot, survived that first really cold winter, and about 75% the second winter did survive of the Cossack. And it looked really good. I mean, it produced a lot of biomass too. So just general observations on the trial. We planted on a pure live seed per foot basis, both years in Aberdeen. We did not figure seed per pound on the clovers where the varieties look more uniform. I didn't go ahead and do that on those, but I got that data on the other ones. We had very contrasting years, those 2 years, as far as the winters go, and the moisture that we received, and the temperatures. The rodents had found our trial plots on by the second year. One thing that really impressed me is the amount of water that we used, the very little amount of water that we used to still get a lot of biomass production on these varieties. So that was impressive to me. And then, like I said, even though we had some like scale or some kind of a disease on our weeds that first year, it didn't seem to affect the species in our trial. We really didn't see a lot of disease in Aberdeen, but we're a lot drier as well than Annie is there. So just wrapping up, working in the field office, there's a few things that I've learned. You can come up with a mix with a variety, but it's not always going to be available in your area. A big stumbling block, I believe, to cover crop adoptants is the weedy portion. Like the best cover crops, the ones that work the best in our area, are also the ones that they're like curse words. Hairy vetch, cereal rye, and annual rye. They just don't want to use them because they're afraid of the weediness. Another stumbling block is, even though you go to a seed supplier and you ask for flax, they may give you a perennial flax. So just education. And then there's a lot more, but that's all I got, and I appreciate the opportunity.
All right, thank you, Terron. Very interesting.